Hey folks, Nathan here. Welcome. This is a mini Q&A for the channel. Yes, recorded on the same day as the other one. Still the Star Wars Report shirt. Trying to get a lot of these knocked out early so we can put them out and get a little nice pace going here for these little mini Q&A videos. This time we pick up with a question from Senator Confer, who asks several questions, and it's a little more elaborate in how it's asked. So, and that's fine. By the way, if you want to ask a question, it needs to be something a little bit longer, like more like a message or an email type thing than a quick question. That's fine. Just means that it's going to take up more time for me to actually read it before I can answer. And depending on the number of parts you put in, it may be a longer answer anyway. So he says, this is a more awkward and intricate question, so I hope it isn't too long, boring, or rude sounding. Oh, that's a good preface. I know I read this at one point and I wasn't pissed off, but I'm kind of wondering where the rudeness thing comes in. Anyway, I preface this by saying that I absolutely love the Star Wars Timeline Gold. Well, thank you. That is my my Star Wars chronology project, over 3,000 pages I worked on for nearly 21 years. It passed its 20th anniversary back in 2017. The project is now done. The final edition is out as of August of 2018. Yeah, it's over at StarWarsFanWars.com/timeline if you've never seen it. Massive, massive fan resource, but not one that is still ongoing. He says, I absolutely love the Star Wars Timeline Gold. Even though it has concluded, I still find myself going back to the last edition to look over what details I might have missed in my favorite or not so favorite stories. Your timeline is actually what pushed me to finally start timelining not just Star Wars, but all forms of media. For this, I can't thank you enough, even though I've nothing actually released as of yet, but it's getting there. Well, that's very cool. I appreciate that. I'm glad to have been able to inspire that. Kind of hoping that at some point I'll inspire some books on other home video stuff as well from people, but seems like home video is very, very niche these days. Even more niche than timelining was, if you can believe it. So, now, with the sappy stuff out of the way, here's my real question or questions. First, why did you settle on Arial, never have known how to say it, I guess Arial, as your font of choice? I have no issue with it, but I'm curious why you chose that. I know that some people prefer Calibri or Times New Roman or maybe a purchasable font, so I honestly am interested in your choice. I think it was by default, if I remember correctly. I wanted something that was sans serif, for those who aren't familiar with it. If you look at like a printed letter like an A, and it's got the little feet on the bottom, that's serifs. So sans serif is just the lines without the little feet. Times New Roman, Times New Roman has feet. It is a serif font. That's S-E-R-I-F, not serif like angels. There are plenty of angelic fonts out there as well. I started it out in Microsoft Works, transferred it to Write, eventually to WordPad, eventually to Word. And in most of those cases, it was because it was getting to a point where it was unmanageable from a loading standpoint and a saving standpoint in the other previous program I was working in. With Works, to Write, it was just for ease of compatibility for people to actually get a chance to read it. So I think it was just that I was looking for something sans serif that looked decent enough and that worked for me, that wasn't going to strain my eyes as I was looking to it so often. And I just kind of grabbed it and stuck with it. I didn't want to go through after changing it into a Microsoft Word file and do a whole lot of changing to it. Because honestly, there's so many instances in that. I mean, imagine the way that I would put in any summary or any event. I'm not formatting that shit every time. I'm copying and pasting a previous entry and then just typing over top of it. Or sometimes it might be an event that I'm pasting and then copying over top of it and changing some like bold and italic stuff to change it to look like a summary instead of a conjecture based on whatever. The end result is that if you actually look at the way that that document is tagged in the original Word file, it's ridiculous how many bolds and italics and all kinds of formatting stuff there is. To the point where sometimes I would copy and paste something and it wouldn't look right because of how the font tags and stuff were embedded. So I wasn't even going to mess with that. Instead, I just stuck with what I had before, which was Arial, which either was a default choice or was the best option out of limited options at some very, very early point in the project's life cycle. Interestingly, it was only later when I did I guess it was when I was doing my master's in education with the specialization in integrating technology in the classroom, where we did some visual learning stuff in a course. And one of the things that they brought up was that if you're wanting to read something in print, it's better to have serifs. If you're wanting to read something on a computer screen, it's better to not have serifs. So it turned out that I had used a font that worked better for reading off a computer screen than off of a print version, which wound up working out great given the fact that it got so friggin' huge that surely no one in their right mind was going to ever print it. But some have. He continues. Second, how has the format of the timeline evolved? I didn't find it until after the canon reboot, so I can only find around release 48 or so on the Wayback Machine. Well, if you actually look in the appendices file of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, you'll see the original file that I call version 0 that became version 1.0, and then 1.0 is in there. The format, think of it as take out all the summaries, take out all the events. So it's just the title listings, and even condense that down so it doesn't list chapters. That's essentially how it started. And eventually it started to list things like chapters and list things like subtitles for things. It was not until version 6.0 in 1999 that I started to add summaries and events, although I'd been taking notes on that for years prior to that. And even then, it didn't fill in the gap of the original trilogy time frame. Kind of got there, and then it picked up afterwards because there's so much stuff in the middle. And then the 7.x releases, which was the gap between 6.0 and the Timeline Gold, named for the fact that, a software will go gold when you expect only minor tweaks to it from then on, not major changes. 7.x was basically the time period in which I was filling in that gap. And once the gap was filled, you had Star Wars Timeline Gold, and then other things have been added to it. Obviously, it grew and changed in terms of the number of documents it needed. It started out as one, eventually wound up having to split now into multiple documents at this point. Canon appendices and volumes 1 and 2 of Legends now, and the Clone Wars supplement for Legends as well. Prior to that, there wasn't a need to pull out the Clone Wars stuff. Prior to 2008, there was a point at which all the Legend stuff could fit on one timeline. There was a point at which all the appendices stuff could go with the Legend stuff on a document. There was also a point at which there was a fan fiction section where I had timelines for various fan fiction universes that were well known, fan films and stuff like that eventually got removed. That's why if you look at the statistical breakdown of the Star Wars Timeline Gold releases in the appendices file, you'll find that one of the things it tracks is the number of fan fiction timelines on each release. And you'll see that it grows and grows, and then it just stops and disappears because there aren't any anymore. So yeah, it's evolved over time. I want to say the best... Gosh, was it the second episode? I mean, it's not up and available anymore, but I want to say back in about the second episode or third episode of my Chrono Radio, my first Star Wars podcast I ever did back in 2002, when it was the 5th anniversary of the Star Wars Timeline Gold. My God, I'm old. It was the 5th anniversary of the Star Wars Timeline Project. It had become the Star Wars Timeline Gold, I believe, at that point. So I did sort of a retrospective episode talking about the evolution of the project itself. But you can sort of see that evolution if you look at the changes from last release notes, because every time I do a new release, I take that and copy it, or every time I did a new release, past tense, I would take those notes and add them to that section, and eventually added them to that section, so that you can actually see when sections are added, when major things change. Everything that's like a minor tweak, I just considered under general stuff, and it's at the bottom of the list. But any new summary, any new section, any removal of a section, major tweaks of a section, all listed on that changes since last release type of listing in the appendices file. Let's see. Third, what all inspired you to timeline for as long as you did? I know it was originally for personal use, but when and why did you decide to make it for thousands of Star Wars fans worldwide? I don't think I ever chose to make it available for thousands of Star Wars fans worldwide. That was not my intent. I made it for my personal use, and back around 1996, 1997, as the prequel fever was heating up, I was on an AOL Star Wars message board called Discuss the Prequels. I still talk to some people that I met even way back then. James Krutzek, Kat Murdo. I mean, people that I met back then online are still part of my Star Wars fandom circles even today. And thinking back to that, there was a point at which people were talking about chronological stuff, and I shared my timeline with them. And they thought, this is cool. I shared it within a post. We talked about it a lot. Eventually, I wound up running with a friend of mine a very, very small Star Wars fan group through email that had a newsletter called Holocron Ramblings that I put together. Really, really terrible newsletter, but a newsletter nonetheless. And attached with one of its early issues before it died an ignominious death was one of the editions of the Star Wars Timeline Gold, or the Star Wars Timeline before it became the Star Wars Timeline Gold. I think it was 2.0 or 2.1 or something with no gold on the end of it. And that became one of the distribution methods, and I eventually got sort of a big mailing list to email new editions of the Timeline out to people, because there wasn't a website to get it on at that point. In fact, at the comic shop where I used to go and then eventually worked for a while when I was in college, there was actually a sign-up book where you could put your name and your email address if you wanted me to add you to the mailing list for it, along with a demo copy of just a few pages of it and a special cover I made for it there, sitting there in a 3-ring binder at the store for a while. This is many years before I wrote for Star Wars Tales, and there was something real for me for Star Wars sitting at the comic shop. Let's see. That actually didn't happen until I moved away from my hometown, so that was kind of a different thing. This is back when I still lived there and was there very, very often. Comic Quest of Evansville, comicquest.com if you're ever in that area. Great big comic and gaming store. And hey, if you catch the owner, Jim Jones, he looks like C.O. Bibble, I swear to God. He could totally be telling you that communication disruptions can mean only one thing, and in that part of the country, it probably means a snowstorm. Anyway, so eventually I put it on a website. I want to say the first one I used was AngelFire, and then it was Zoom, like XOOM, which became NBCI, I think, eventually. Then I wound up having it on Lou Tambone's Star Wars website under their fandom banner when he had that. And then there came a point where he decided to relaunch Star Wars with a Z, that's STARWRZ.com, and T-Bone Star Wars Universe, and relaunch all of that at once. At which point the timeline sort of took up residence, thanks to web design by Sonia Nelson, alongside my StarWarsFanWorks.com, also with web design initially by Sonia Nelson, that together were part of that relaunch back in 2003 that allowed it to have a much more obvious presence online. But I mean, I never really set out for it to be huge. I never really realized that it had gotten as big as it was until I started lately looking at some of the download numbers, looking at some of the past download numbers. I mean, they're much bigger than I ever would have expected, especially since generally people will download it 1 month and not need to re-download it again for like a year. So, holy crap, that's a lot of downloads. But I think that's just the nature of the internet. As word gets around, social media and stuff like that allows projects like this to get that kind of attention and grow in its readership or listenership or whatever much faster than it used to. Like, there was a time with Chrono Radio that I was stoked to break 100 listeners for that podcast. But that's back in the day where if you wanted a podcast, you had to know it existed, go to its website, download it, and listen to it by downloading it manually. There were no pod-catching software programs out there at the time. The term podcasting didn't exist when I started Chrono Radio, nor when my few predecessors in the Star Wars podcasting or fan audio genre started their shows a year before Digital Emma Radio and Star Wars on Direct, and a couple years before both of them, Jedi Talk, which we were it at that point. We were it, meaning in 2002 when I launched Chrono Radio, it was just them and me. I mean, there just wasn't very many of us. Not to say that I was the first. I was not the first, nor was some of the shows out there that claim to be the first these days, but that's a whole other topic. But I mean, now, you can measure podcast listenerships in huge, huge numbers, which is actually, I think, part of why I don't really look at the numbers very much. Like every once in a while, I'll go look at the listenership numbers for Star Wars Beyond the Films, and it always kind of makes me laugh because they're always talking about, well, let's how do we get more listeners? Or how do we have more people, engage and whatnot? And I'm looking at the Facebook page numbers, and I'm looking at the download numbers, and I'm thinking, man, slice some zeros off of this, and I would have been happy when I started. It gets to a point where the numbers are just academic, where it's just like, whether it's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or whatever of people listening at any given time to any given library of your work, whether it's 10 people, you're putting it out there as a labor of love and you're hoping that other people will enjoy it, but you're doing it because you enjoy it too. I would probably still podcast even if damn near no one was listening. I'd probably still be making these videos if no one was watching it. There are some videos, like, it sort of actually kind of boggles my mind. On Patreon, we have 3 tiers, right? The top tier is the Nobility of the Butlerniverse, $10 support, right? Below that is the $5 support tier, which is the Denizens of the Butlerniverse. That second tier, they've got the audio commentaries. What distinguishes that from the level above, the Nobility tier, is an exclusive monthly Q&A video. We have gone months where there have been no questions asked for those videos, to the point where I've sort of come up with questions to make a 1-question episode each time. And there's at least one of those in the last few months where none of the people who are paying for the privilege of getting access to that video, as opposed to being on the lower tier and just doing the commentaries, haven't asked questions, and nobody's watched it either. And yet I still do them. I think it comes down to sort of a similar thing to what happened with the timeline, to kind of bring this back around to his question, which is that there's a sense of obligation. In the case there of what I was mentioning with the Patreon, it's something I've guaranteed each month. I didn't guarantee people were going to watch it each month. I guaranteed I would put that out each month, and people asked questions, I would use them to make the episodes and answer all their questions each month. And to some degree, that's kind of what the timeline turned into, in that people started to rely on it. I started to hear more and more from people relying on it, including some official authors who relied on it when they were working, as a cross-reference to what they had from, for instance, Leland Shee with the Holocron, because the Holocron Continuity Database is basically a giant database. It exports as Excel files, like some of the ones that I was given when assisting on the Essential Atlas. It's not a chronological document per se, at least not in its nature. So people were using that, which was cool. It's where I got my first mention in the Star Wars book, the thank you from Dan Wallace, the acknowledgement from Dan Wallace back in the New Essential Guide to Characters. I started to see that, but that was right around the era where most of the other major timeliners had stopped doing so. In particular, Time Tales, which is the closest equivalent to the timeline, who actually did events first, they had stopped, and that project had essentially died. And many of the other ones were falling by the wayside, and it's sort of one of those. It reminds me of one of my favorite quotes out of Deep Space Nine, to cross the streams here. Oh, more references to other franchises, is the line from Garak that is then used by Bashir in Our Man Bashir, probably my favorite single episode of Deep Space Nine, where he's basically doing a James Bond thing in the holodeck, and it's how do you think, something along the lines of, how do you think I've stayed alive for so long when all of my compatriots are dead? It's because I have known when to walk away. To which I'm sure that a Benjamin Sisko bad guy would go, "Pop!" because that's how he laughs at the situation, which was great. It's one of those things where it's sort of like, I managed to survive with the project because I knew when to retailer it, and when to put my life first, and when to step back and say, okay, monthly releases aren't happening anymore. Bi-monthly aren't happening anymore. We are now going to do yearly. And this is how I'm going to approach it, and so on and so on. And these are the projects that I have been working on that I'm going to set aside now because I don't have the time for them anymore, and so on and so on. But I did those changes as opposed to making the timeline. It was such a time sink, the thing that got dropped much, much earlier than 20 plus years into it, because I felt a sense of obligation. Being the only one out there doing something like that, and being someone who had sunk, at that point, 2 decades into it, or nearing on 2 decades at the time, made me realize that if I didn't do it, who would? But I let that sense of obligation keep me doing it well past when I probably should have, to the point where it wasn't fun anymore, and I needed to step away. And we talked about that in a different video, why I stepped away, why the timeline had its final edition in that. And it has been a breath of fresh air. I do not regret that decision. But the fact that it stayed around for so long was less due to my passion for it, and more due to the feeling of obligation I had that if I didn't do it, who would? And that should not be your rationale for giving up a giant portion of your life to a project to which you would make no money, and so on. I mean, it's one of those things where you have to be willing to look at your own mental health and your own free time, or lack thereof, and make that kind of decision to cut certain things off. And I let that feeling of obligation drive me to the point where I just had to stop. I had to finally be the one to hit the brakes. It was like I was George Lucas on The Phantom Menace, and the only person I had at my side was Rick McCollum saying, yeah, that's great, yeah, that's great, yeah, that's great, and nobody willing to say no when I ran into the wall. So Yes, it was a sense of obligation to a degree. Why it lasted so long, but it never was set out to be something that's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands or whatever people would use. It was just something for my benefit that I thought would be cool to share with others that sort of took on a life of its own. And then it says, finally, in the last years of the timeline, why did you never switch to Google Docs as a secondary host for the timeline? I asked because you were able to post view-only links to your document, allowing everyone to see it. Was it simply a preference for the yearly releases along with making sure there were no errors? Apologies if this seems presumptuous of me. Thanks for reading, answering, and being a great guy to talk Star Wars with. So it was really kind of a practical matter in the way that I worked. It wasn't something where I would make a small tweak and it was like ready to be seen. A lot of times between releases, I'd go in and take something like, the changes from last release or something, and I just yank it out and put just a double question mark there so it was easy to search for. To know I got to go back to this some point. Sometimes it was like ASDF. I know I got to search for that and go back to it at some point. I'd put in like like I know a summary's coming, but I'm not done with the book yet. But I kind of know where I want to put it. So here's the tag for the title of the summary with ASDF above it. Those intermediate steps, just those were not ready for public view. I didn't actually get rid of all of the little notes to myself and all that kind of crap cluttering up the document each time until the day before final release, because I needed those notes to guide me in what I was doing. So could I have done something a little bit differently? Possibly. But it wasn't part of my workflow process for it. And I was never someone who really worked with Google Docs very much until I started teaching online. And even then, not really a lot with Google Docs. It's more the Office 365 suite that we use now, but we use Google Sites and Google Docs to host projects for our students now. Other than that, I really haven't messed around too much with Google Docs, really much at all. Though I know that I could have at the time. I'm just kind of an old cranky bastard that way. Old cranky man. With that, I think we'll wrap this one up. Thank you, Senator Confer, for those questions. I want to make sure these all stay at a reasonable length. So we'll pick up with more questions next time. If you want to ask more questions for me to use in future mini Q&As, put them in the comments down below. I'll pick some of those to answer. And going to try to record more of these tonight, still in the same sitting. If I can handle the heat and keep my voice. Seeing the color was even going weird there. It's Mustafarian in here, I tell you. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your questions, and I'll catch you on the next Q&A.